Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast. I am joined today by Madison Darbyshire. She is a reporter at Bloomberg Weekend. I know I say this a lot. I mean, I love all of my podcasts. This was a great podcast episode. I learned a lot. It's geopolitical in ways you couldn't have even anticipated. Madison was great. Shout out to Madison. Thank you for coming on the podcast and for being so down and so passionate about the stuff that you're reporting about. I thought this was just an exceptional episode, and I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I do. And I hope that you follow Madison's work and read the original article because it is frightening. You can reach out to me at jacob@jacobshapiro.com if you have any comments, questions, concerns about any of the episodes or anything like that. Other than that, take care of the people that you love. Watch out for Screwworms. I will see you out there. Madison, thank you for joining an illustrious list of people who respond to a random cold call podcast invite. It's nice to meet you.
Oh, well, thank you for emailing. It's nice to have people interested in Screwworms.
At least me. And I come by my interest honestly, so I'll tell a little story for the readers first before we back into talking about Screwworm, which is poorly named. It's a fly. I don't know why they called it, but maybe you'll tell us why the name is incorrect.
Certainly,
but
yeah.
I spent a couple of weeks in my youth when I was a senior in high school at a kibbutz in Israel called Kibbutz Sterilizing in Beit Shean. And there is a company based at the kibbutz that is owned by the kibbutz called BioBee. I was working in the date trees, so I was like being hoisted up into these like 50-foot date trees, like almost died at one point. It was ridiculous that I was even there. But so there was a little shed on the kibbutz where if you would go in, it would just be a bunch of dead flies in there. And they were manufacturing sterile male fruit flies to go after the Mediterranean fruit fly, which a whole bunch of reasons why that's a significant pest. And they were the leading exporter of this. And some listeners may know the kibbutz movement in Israel is dying a slow death. There are not many true kibbutzim left in the sense that, the true socialist little enclaves with their own money and things like that. And this one survived. And they survived because they got the corner on the Mediterranean fruit fly, sterile fly market. So anytime I see a story that is like even tangentially related to that, I'm like back as a senior in high school running around this kibbutz in Israel and finding dead flies. So that's the backdrop for why I'm interested. Also, we have tons of ag listeners to this podcast, Madison. Also geopolitics, like U.S.-Mexico relations. It actually cuts a lot of different areas where people are going to be interested and probably not a story people are following. So let's start with the basics because my listeners probably aren't going to know a lot about this except for the, 20 cattle farmers who are listening. What is screwworm? What are we talking about?
So the screwworm, the full name is the New World screwworm, and it is a fly. It's like a little bit larger than a housefly, whose larvae eat living flesh. They operate like any fly, but they lay their eggs on wounds, open wounds. They could be as small as a tick bite or as big as a scrape or a larger cut, sometimes the umbilical cord of animals that are just born, noses, udders, they can get in through mucous membranes. And once the fly lays its larva, the larva then burrow kind of deep into the animal and feed on the flesh, kind of essentially eating that animal alive. And so they're gross. And another crazy thing about them is once a fly has established an infection on a wound, it emits like an aroma that attracts other flies to the wound. And so then you end up with like a massive infestation of screwworms kind of eating this animal from the inside out. And then after the animal is like fed, or the larva has fed for 5 to 10 days, it drops into the earth and then pupates. So they don't just infect animals, they infect regions, which is one of the reasons that they are such a dangerous pest. But nobody's ever heard of them because they've essentially not existed in the United States or anywhere north of Panama for a generation. They've been gone from the US since essentially the 60s, but realistically the 80s, and they've been kind of contained below Panama since basically the millennium. Is that helpful?
And
is that
tell
enough?
us, it's perfect and it's disgusting. Tell us the story of how this happened, because to your point, I mean, 1980s, like it's multiple generations that people haven't had to deal with this problem. But if you were a cattle rancher in Texas in the 1930s or 40s and 50s, you probably would have been all up on your screwworm knowledge and things like that. So how is it that over a 20, 30-year period, we were able to eradicate this pest so successfully?
For sure. So the screwworm was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, agricultural blights on livestock in America from the 1930s to the 1980s. It was a huge deal. It cost farmers millions of dollars a year to like have enough staff to be able to treat animals with screwworms, to be able to inspect for screwworms, to be able to deal with the livestock loss that screwworms caused. They did crazy things like move the calving season up. So typically calves would be born in the spring, but that meant that they were being born right at peak screwworm infestation time. So they started having calves be born in the winter, in the fall, so that they had, like cold months to survive. But essentially, in the late 1930s, a USDA scientist had this idea that if he realized that you could essentially like weaponize the patriarchy to destroy the screwworm, because he realized that the male screwworms were very promiscuous. They would mate multiple times over their lifespan, but the female screwworms would only mate once in their lifetime. So he was like, if you could sterilize the male flies, you could essentially interrupt the reproductive cycle of these flies so thoroughly that they would cease to exist. And it would take another like 20 years for this to become a reality. It got interrupted by World War II. The scientist involved, his last name's Nippling, and I'm going to forget what the first name is. I want to say like Rudyard, but that's Rudyard Kipling. I have it in my. Do you want me to just say it out loud so you have it so you could splice it?
You're close. It's Edward, and I'm going to keep it in because there's like an Edward and a Raymond there, and you made that Rudyard, so I think that's close enough, especially
Edward
with
Nippling. Essentially, he got put on like World War II. How do you keep mosquitoes off of soldiers during the war research? So the answer was DDT, which ended up being problematic, but that was something they dealt with later. And then after the war, he started focusing on screwworms again because they were just terrorizing livestock in the South of America. And they used technology that was developed during the war, nuclear technology, to use gamma rays to sterilize male flies at scale. And so they were able to, in these kind of factories, sterilize millions of male screwworms. And then they would just put them in these cardboard boxes and throw them out of the back of airplanes. And the airplane, the pressure of the air would essentially like explode the cardboard box, and sterile flies would rain down a lot around ranch land and animals, and essentially just interrupt the mating cycle of the mating cycle of the local screwworms. And it took until they were approached by the government of Curacao to say like, okay, here's an experiment. We have a contained island where screwworms are endemic. Let's see if we can eliminate them completely. And so they dropped hundreds of millions of sterile flies over Curacao and essentially wiped out the screwworm completely. There was no more screwworms, and they thought, okay, maybe this is actionable across broader swaths of land. They started using it in Florida because Florida's peninsula is geographically well set up for testing if you can push screwworms out. And they essentially, over the course of decades, were able to push screwworms in from the coast, because up to that point, they had been terrorizing farmers from California to the Florida Keys. And they were able to push them in to the Midwest. So essentially, Texas was the worst hit constantly by screwworms because they'd come up from South America. But they were able to kind of contain them. And there was, for the first time in generations around the screwworm, there was hope. And that was a crazy thing for ranchers. I talked to one rancher when I was reporting this story who described it. It was like turning a spigot off. All of a sudden, the population was so small that you could treat it on a relatively stable basis, but it didn't get rid of the problem entirely.
Mm-hmm.
And then
how much? And then we'll get into it. How much? Do you have a sense of how much did this cost at the time? Because this is a great example of an initiative that is backed by the U.S. government for research. It probably doesn't happen if the private sector is doing it, and I would argue that that's what the government is for. It's there to backstop things when the interests of private markets aren't. It's not going to make it economical. But so, like you said, like hundreds of millions of fruit flies on this one island. Like what kind of cost are we talking about?
The costs that I've heard are anywhere from like $3 to $10 million a year. I want to check that number. I know that to maintain. It cost millions. It didn't cost the government as much to produce these flies as it was costing ranchers to deal with having them, essentially. But it was millions of dollars a year that the government was allocating to screwworm research. It was wildly unpopular in Washington because it sounded ridiculous. it was an easy thing for representatives to poke fun at wasteful government spending, to say that, why are we messing with the sex lives of flies? Why is this something that we're spending hard earned taxpayer dollars on? And it, obviously, well, rural causes have never been particularly well represented in Washington. And so this was it was something that was a hard sell to elected representatives, to get them to say, like, yes, let's continue to invest money in sterilizing male flies, because if we can make, promiscuous flies sterile, then we can interrupt this plague essentially on Southern America. But it got it was so successful, ultimately so successful, that people began to think, and I think this kind of explains a little bit about how it got started on your kibbutz, but journalists started to envision a future in which mosquitoes would not be, the music of the summer would not be the whine of mosquitoes. It became something where people started to imagine, what other possibilities could sterile flies be used for? Could it be any insect? Could it be fruit flies? And they started to invest in how they could use it in grown agriculture like oranges and fruits, as well as, treating mosquitoes to prevent things like fly-borne illness, malaria, things like that. So it was truly the discovery of the sterile fly technique was one of the most innovative scientific advancements of the 20th century. To the point where they would describe Nippling, and they would say he was going to be remembered on the same plane as Galileo, or the scientist who invented vaccines. But obviously, we've forgotten all about him. But unfortunately, his sticking power has not been as great as we thought it might be.
Yeah, I mean, this, I'm gonna like show how truly nerdy I am, in the sense that when I was reading your article, it felt almost like Lord of the Rings, where it's like something terrible happened a generation ago, and then everybody forgot about it, and it all became a myth, and nobody knows what it is, and then like the ancient threat is like rising up again, and now people are freaking out about it and trying to figure out the old ways that they did it.
Truly. I
Um,
mean, that's what got me really preoccupied with screwworms, because I was just having an ordinary conversation with a rancher. We were talking about wild antelope of some description, and I just asked him, like, what else is on your mind? And he said, well, I'm pretty preoccupied with the return of the New World screwworm. And I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? He's like, it was only the biggest thing ever, essentially. And I couldn't believe that this thing had existed that was so grotesque, and the impact it had was so profound, and nobody had ever heard of it. And I went to this conference to talk to ranchers, and essentially I was just walking up to old ranchers and just being like, do you remember the screwworm? And all of them were saying, I do, but I was a kid when it happened, and my kids don't know about it. And if anyone under the age of 65 has heard of the screwworm, it's just because they heard about it at parties or family reunions. And honestly, the screwworm was not something people wanted to talk about, because it was so bitter and so gross, and the work was so relentless, that once it was over, people, I think a lot like, the Spanish flu and what we're seeing with the way that we're moving on from COVID, like, people just wanted to forget. And so they did.
and so they did. Um, and maybe Edward will get his time in the sun. Like maybe he'll come back, and we will anoint him
Maybe.
along with Galileo and others. But so to your point, it was so successful, according to your article, that they managed to basically establish. I love this image too, of like establishing a barrier of sterile flies at the Darien Gap. So it's like you can go no further than this, and we were just pumping out flies with Panama at this point to try, not
Yeah.
to try. We were maintaining the sterile border. So the first question I want to ask there is, why didn't they go further? Because presumably it's still a problem in South America. Like, what was I get that, you don't want to spend so much money to eradicate it across another continent or things like that, but you would think that other countries would take note of this and be like, okay, like we can do that. Like, why didn't other South American countries like take the baton and then keep going?
I don't have a great answer for why the US didn't push further. I know one of the reasons that the Darien Gap was seen as an ideal place to build the sterile border was because it's narrow. It's the narrowest point of Central America. It was relatively rural at the time. You could use a very small amount of flies and have a very effective border. A lot of the countries in which screwworms are still endemic just lack funding and resources to be able to execute a project on that scale.
Hmm.
And there is a sense that a number of the countries that deal with this problem, that there's an acceptance that they just lose 20 to 30% of their cattle every year. Um, and they also struggle with it more in human populations because people are more exposed to the elements. There's a different standard of living for a lot of people. They struggle with more poverty. And screwworms affect people too. And one of the big risks of it returning to the US is that the unhoused population in the southern US is pretty profound. And screwworms are a natural blight for a population that can't really defend itself from them. But I don't have a full answer for why it didn't go further south of Panama. For the US, I mean, the US, one of the reasons it pushed south into Mexico and kind of set up this network of geopolitical cooperation down the Central American continent was because it was expensive. To maintain a border of sterile flies across the US and Mexico, Lyndon B. Johnson was complaining that it cost $5 million a year. It still had breakthroughs into Texas. Every year they were kind of shoving it south of the border again and again. And they realized that in order to get rid of the screwworm, they needed to eradicate it ocean to ocean. And so they started thinking, Mexico's shaped like a funnel. What if we could just push it all the way to the bottom of the funnel? And then it was so effective that they just kept going.
Hmm.
And the Darien Gap was the most cost-effective place for them to set up shop.
As you were talking to, I'm based in New Orleans. I don't even know if you know that. And I grew up in the Southeast in a small farm outside Atlanta, Georgia. And my childhood was not to the whine of mosquitoes, but was to the sight of fireflies, like in our yard or in our pastures and things like that. And when my wife kidnapped me and brought me to New Orleans, one of my first things that I was confused about was, why are there no fireflies in New Orleans? Like, there should be fireflies here. And there are not, because in the quest to get rid of malaria and all the mosquitoes that they killed in the quest to get rid of malaria, they killed all of the fireflies. And I actually went down a huge rabbit hole of like, could I find someone to breed fireflies so I could at least like release them into my backyard and at least have fireflies? And I could not find anyone who bred fireflies. So if you have any contacts out there, listeners, or you, Madison, who will breed me some fireflies to bring them back to New Orleans, I'm with you. But to your point, like there was this idea that we could eradicate these things, and it just stops all of a sudden. Like, it's almost like we were satisfied with what we had and we didn't want to go any further.
That breaks my heart for you. But in that vein, screwworms were the first environmentally friendly approach to eradicate, the first non-chemical approach to
Hmm.
eradicating flies, which was huge, to not have to drop gallons of DDT across, like America's agricultural heartland was a huge deal. And I'm sorry that what happened to your fireflies, because what is summer without fireflies blinking in the distance?
Well, I'm exactly there with you. Okay, so that's some past and some context for listeners. So, and this is auspiciously timed. I mean, I reached out to you a couple weeks ago. I believe Brooke Rollins, what was it, 4 days ago, 3 days ago, halted all cattle coming in from Mexico again. She
Yeah.
did it in November. Then there was a letter back and forth with the ambassador a couple weeks ago. We can go into all that. But before we get to sort of why this is actually a really present issue, this is not just academic. What happened? How did the screwworm come back? How was it that it was cordoned off in the Darien Gap and then suddenly we're dealing with it again?
So the way it was explained to me is it was kind of a perfect storm of events that began in the pandemic. There were supply chain issues with the sterile fly facility in Panama. It was harder for them to execute on sterile fly drops. Um, there were staffing shortages because people weren't going to work in person. People were getting sick, so there just weren't as many staff either and at the screwworm factory as well as at inspection posts. So a big part of how the screwworm issue is actively managed. It's not just sterile flies. There are a lot of inspectors on the ground looking at cattle crossing borders, making sure no cattle have screwworm infections that are moving across checkpoints. There just weren't as many of them. And then the Darien Gap, when they established the border, was a relatively remote jungle. And in the last few years, we've seen a pretty tremendous migration of people and animals through the Darien Gap that has kind of transformed the landscape of the region. It's not a remote jungle anymore. There's a lot of people who live there, who have businesses there, a lot of people moving through. And I mean, one of the things that you hear in the debate around screwworms, and one of the ways that it is kind of being weaponized today, is attaching it to the idea of migrants moving through the Darien Gap, bringing the screwworm with them, which is not an accurate representation of how the screwworm moved through the Darien Gap. It just transformed the landscape. And there was also a real rise in the amount of illegal cattle transport. So people were moving cattle across borders and saying, you know what, I'm not going to mess around with USDA checkpoints or government checkpoints. We're just going to go, the back road and avoid that entirely. And part of why the screwworm spread so fast is because nobody in the business at the moment, nobody illegally transporting cattle as well as operating cattle ranches in the center of America has ever seen a screwworm. It's been gone for so long that people don't even know that that's why the checkpoints exist. They think like this is a bureaucratic headache and I don't want to pay for it, I don't want to deal with it. But a big part of why that exists is to prevent the transport of parasites like this. And then when they started popping up in Panama and other countries going further north, people just didn't really know that they were supposed to be looking for it. And so a lot of the screwworm cases that were early went unnoticed. And once a screwworm infestation kind of crosses a border, as we know, they infect whole areas, not just animals, and they get into wildlife like birds and raccoons and deer are a huge population that are afflicted by the screwworm, and then they move on their own because nobody's inspecting raccoons, right? This the screwworm kind of takes a life of its own in a place, and that's one of the reasons why it's been able to spread north so effectively in the last few years.
One of the craziest statistics from your article was about how the white-tailed deer population rebounded 600% after they,
Yeah.
got rid of screwworm too. So to your point, it's not just cattle, which, my father-in-law will be interested in that as a deer hunter, and so will all the avid deer hunters that are probably listening.
I talked to all these ranchers who were kids in Texas who had never seen a deer because it just wasn't a reality for them when they were growing up. Deer just weren't popular. And now deer are so populous to the point of being a nuisance. They represent a huge amount of the income for a lot of the southern states in terms like the amount of money people pay for hunting permits. And all of that's kind of at risk right now.
That's
Again.
wild. Like people in Texas who didn't see deer regularly. Like I
Yeah.
lived in Texas for a while. That's like an absolutely mind-boggling concept.
It blew my mind to learn that deer had once been like scarce in Southern America. But they were able to rebound really quickly. But one of the issues with deer is like when they have fawns, the navels of the fawns are basically, exposed scabs for months, and that's fertile territory for a screwworm infestation.
Is there any chance this seems like you said that, there really aren't generations of inspectors who even know anything about this, and the idea that we're going to train people up quickly seems like a total impossibility. But this seems like it would be great for AI and for drones and things like that. Like, is that part of the solution set at all here? Is that even being talked about, or is that too am I being too optimistic?
Not that I've heard about. There are some people who are operating I'd have to check. There's a man who reached out to me who wanted to be connected with a USDA vet who operates a kind of parasite detection system using scent, being able to smell the parasites. But I don't know that it's something that I don't know how. It's a good question, but I don't actually know how AI and drones would operate in this, given that the flies are, pupating inside animals and in the ground. Like if it's in a sheep, you can't see it. You can just smell it. It's all underneath the woolly fur. But there are vets who kind of expect that patient zero in the U.S. will probably be a dog, because most veterinarians in the U.S. have never seen a screwworm, and they've never seen a domestic case. Maybe they heard about it in vet school, that it's not the kind of thing you look for. Whereas the USDA teams that inspect cattle are very much looking for screwworms. I'd say they'd be our first line of defense. We just have been kind of actively dismantling government agencies for the last few months.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions. Like, to what extent is the Department of Government Efficiency's assault on things like the USDA, like, is that already showing up? Has Brooke Rollins realized that this is the wrong thing, and she called Elon and said, please reverse course on this one, like sort of like firing the nuclear reactor guy or the nuclear guys, and be like, no, actually, we need you to come back. Like, is it hurting already?
Well, the USDA has really pushed back on staffing cuts. You saw it with the avian flu, you saw it with the bird flu and the egg price skyrocketing, that there was a real sense that no, these are people who are essential workers. And so they have gone back and forth with USDA employees about whether or not they should consider taking the packages that are being offered to them by the DOJ Department of Government Efficiency. But there is a lot of anxiety that in my reporting, I heard a lot of anxiety from people in government agencies about how their staff were feeling about wanting to stay in the agency, among veterinarians who work with government agencies about how confident they felt that the government was making this a priority in terms of staffing. There was money that was dedicated under the Biden administration to fighting back against the screwworm, but there was no dedicated staffing that came with that or has come under the Trump administration. So there's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety around what is going to happen to the staffing required to fight this problem.
I know that your reporting wasn't exactly on this, but maybe you sort of or tangentially were around it. Because, I mean, this is not just a U.S. problem, too. This is a Mexican problem. And one of the confusing things to me in trying to read through this, because, geopolitics is my bailiwick, and trying to understand how it is that there are tensions between the U.S. and Mexican governments over this. Like, it seems like a layup, and you've got the first sort of ban, correct me if I'm wrong, in November, and then promises that they're going to do something, and then a letter to the Mexican ambassador from Rollins herself saying, you guys are holding us up. We need 7 days of flights, and you're only giving us 6 days, and you're putting tariffs on the flies and tariffs on the import things. Like, we need to move forward, and Mexico saying, okay, fine, like, go forward, but then it's not happening, so then they're doing bans. So, like, something seems to not be happening here, but it also seems to be like Mexico itself has lost, like, did they also lose the institutional memory? Was it not as big of a deal for them? Like, is it just everybody like forgot about this thing except the Panamanians who are making the flies? Like, it's literally mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, no, everybody forgot. And it happened at a very interesting time. The US has, been actively antagonizing the Mexican government for the last 6 months. We've not been not antagonizing the Panamanian government at, like, all the talk about the Panama Canal made me start to think, like, how excited is Panama about scaling up its operation and being solely responsible for a continental screwworm crisis? So it is happening at a time where relationships between the U.S. and Mexican government have been strained. You saw the response to the first letter from the Mexican equivalent of the USDA was very frustrated and angry and felt like the US was asking them to roll over and do whatever they wanted, and Mexico doesn't want to be treated like, a plate. What is the word I'm looking for? They want to be treated with respect in this crisis the same way that anyone would. It's going to affect a tremendous amount of their livestock and their ranchers. And while the US funds most of the operation happening in Panama, the US has also, in some ways dropped the ball on its ability to respond to this crisis itself. It no longer has a facility to produce sterile screwworms domestically. It decided it was a problem that was happening outside its borders. About a decade ago, it handed over the other factory that was operating in southern Mexico to the Mexican government to maintain. They're expensive to maintain. At some point, the Mexican government was like, there is no domestic problem, so we can use this facility for something else. And so everybody has kind of forgotten that the screwworm threat could come back. It's fair to say that maybe we were all a little bit arrogant and thought that this was a maintenance problem rather than something that had to be actively managed. But we're seeing that with the return of things like the measles. You forget that equilibrium requires constant maintenance and in some ways constant paranoia, that bad things can happen again. And that's, it's just not an inherent part of the US's DNA. And then when there's a crisis, we need a finger to point. And I think at the moment that finger is being pointed at Mexico. There has been a lot of frustration among USDA vets about bureaucracy or the ability to get the things that it says it needs in order to fight the screwworm in Mexico. But there seems to be an increased amount of urgency in the last few weeks that makes people optimistic that that could improve. Sorry, I'm rambling because I'm just
you're not.
very excited about this topic.
You're here to ramble.
Yeah.
I mean, this technology is almost 100 years old now. Like, how hard would it be to start sterilizing fruit flies? Like, you would think not that much, I would think.
Screwworms.
Sorry. I had a flashback.
As easy as you think that it would be, and I talked to some old ranchers at a conference who were demanding to know at this panel, like, why was this not happening already? Why was there not a solution already in train? Part of it is getting Washington to pay attention to this has been an uphill battle for the last year. Nobody on the Hill knows what a screwworm is or remembers a screwworm because it's, an older generation's problem. And for a lot of people, it was just always a solved problem. So getting the government to say, like, yes, we're willing to give you maybe $1 billion to rebuild this facility in Texas, which the estimates currently are that it'll take 2 to 3 years to bring back online, which is not, time that nobody has in the screwworm battle. So it is a surprisingly slow and expensive process to bring, a decommissioned factory back online.
That doesn't make sense to me. I like if this were China, like I would imagine like Xi Jinping would be like, okay, we need the factory done in a month, and anybody who doesn't, like, if anybody who's stopping this, like, there's a gulag for you in Xinjiang, like, with your name on it if you can't get this done. Like, the idea that it would take that many years and even that much money to do this, like,
yeah,
I don't know.
Maybe the urgency. I mean, flesh-eating worms is a grabby headline, right? So maybe the urgency will come, but in a time where government spending is actively being policed to the penny, it's hard to imagine, suddenly throwing resources at something that only is going to affect a small portion of America.
Well, and if it's going to take $1 billion, like you say, like I was asking, because I thought maybe some independent-minded Texas, ranchers could say, screw this, forgive the terrible pun. Like, let's vertically integrate. Like, let's build a factory like right here on some of this land and just like do it ourselves, and we'll charge for it. Like, let's make a profit out of this and send it down to Mexico and to all these other places. But if it's $1 billion, like that's not gonna fly.
Wow, that was awful.
Yeah, great.
Great. It was fantastic, actually. Estimates range. The USDA says less than $1 billion. Ranchers who are trying to get Washington buy-in estimate around $350 million because they don't want to float a number that is too astronomical. But it's going to be expensive. And ranchers did dedicate a tremendous amount of money to solving this the first time around. So a lot of the initial factory building money came from American ranchers because the government wasn't giving them the money that they needed. They didn't feel like the urgency was there. And we are seeing that again, except U.S. cattle doesn't have the money that it used to. It's a much tighter industry in terms of margins. Ranchers have been struggling with things like drought for the last 25 years. There's fewer cattle in the U.S. now than there's ever been. Costs of beef are at an all-time high. So it's not like ranchers, it's not like the show Yellowstone where they're flying in on helicopters. I mean, some wealthy landowners do well, but most ranchers are just really salt of the earth people who can't actually afford to have yet another headwind to their business.
Well, there's your answer right there, though. Taylor Sheridan, you need to listen to this podcast and get off your butt. Like, donate all of the profits from Landman or one of your series to like doing this, and do it on the 3.6s or whatever it was that you bought down in Texas. Like, you should have enough money to do that sort of thing. No, I'm sure you're not
He's the
listening.
only one who can save us now. Taylor Sheridan.
God. Can you imagine Taylor Sheridan as the Secretary of Agriculture?
Well, his ranch is in Southwest U.S. He's in a vulnerable region for the screwworms. They're going to travel further north than they ever have before because winter is an increasingly distant memory as well in some parts of the U.S. And so who knows? Maybe it will come knocking on his front door and he'll have to get involved.
Okay, we'll definitely tweet at him and see if we can't get some attention from him. Maybe he'll do a whole series about the screw. It's a great story. Like I bet you could do some great stuff with it. Maybe like add a little zombie flair to it, and you could really increase attention that way.
Well, if you've seen some of the pictures of animals that are being eaten by screwworms, it does kind of have its own zombie flair. You don't even need to add it. Yeah. So
Well,
there was a rancher, I don't know if this is in the story, but I was talking to a rancher at this conference who was like, I was asking him, how would you describe the screwworm? What was it like? And ranchers are not, you know, super emotive. They're very stoic. I was asking about, they would describe the screwworm as steady work because it was all day, every day for months at a time. But I was like, what was it? How would you describe the screwworm to, me, a Yankee who's never seen them? And he's like, well, have you seen Ghostbusters? And I was like, yeah. He's like, it was kind of like that. It's kind of like Ghostbusters. And it was just so gross to think about. A
yeah.
hole in an animal the size of your fist all the way down. They screw, so that's where the term screwworm comes from, is the larvae look like little screws. They have kind of screw-like mouths that just turn deep inside an animal, and they just bury themselves. It's not like just a surface wound, the way some maggots eat
Hmm.
necrotic flesh around the surface of a wound. They will go all the way in. And that is what makes them so deadly and cause so much damage.
Yeah, and that thing you said about them like not infecting animals but regions. I mean, that sounds very Last of Us like sort of
Hmm.
thing, like where they're just spreading everywhere.
Yeah.
Um, so one other thing I wanted to ask you was that the way that Secretary Rollins is talking, and I guess she has to talk this way. It's not like she can be like, "Hey, we're fucked. Like we can't. Like this is going to be here for 10 or 20 years." But it felt like in your
Hmm.
reporting they were saying things like, "This is even if we had all the resources that we needed to combat this, we're talking about 10 to 20 years before we get this under control. This is going to happen. It's just a matter of time before it breaches the border, and like we're in a fight, like a generational fight here against this thing." Versus
Hmm.
Secretary Rollins, who is talking and pushing herself, pushing her geopolitical heft around with Mexico, sort of talking like, no, 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 like if we can just get some planes going, like we got this, like we can contain this. This is not going to happen to the American farmer again. So
Hmm.
it sounds like both of those are extremes. But how are you benchmark? Like, is this already a foregone conclusion for the American farmer? Is there still a way to turn it back with what we have?
Mm.
Like, is there any hope whatsoever?
Well, I think it's important to remember that Secretary Rollins is the political appointee and who her boss is, and what her boss's priorities are, which a lot of that has to do with narrative. Because no, I when I was reporting this story, there were moments ahead of publication where I was like, "Am I insane? Like, is thinking that this is a big problem crazy? Like, why is nobody else writing about this? Why is nobody screaming about this? This feels like a big deal." And I had honestly, because I had talked to some government officials, like going to this cattle conference in Fort Worth, Texas, where the USDA came to speak about the screwworms, I honestly thought maybe I was overreacting, like thinking that this was a worthy news story. And I walked away so much more afraid than I had been, because the candor of these veterinarians who work on this issue all the time, some of whom have spent significant time in Panama, who actively liaise with the Mexican government to try and find solutions to this, were so scared about where we're at and how long it's going to take to reverse this because of how behind we are already on our response. So I that's kind of how I would explain the fracture between what you're going to hear from a government body. I mean, I asked the USDA about the staffing cuts, and the response I got was very much like President Trump is committed to preserving the dollars of the American taxpayer and being super judicious about headcount. It was very much this narrative of we are doing everything right, even if it's cutting jobs that will ultimately be, involved in this problem. Whereas the people who focus more on the international side of this, where, oh, here's how I would describe it. So I talked to a veterinarian who had just gotten back from Panama. He had just visited the factory where they make the sterile worms. He had been really impressed by the operation there, by the professionalism and the candor of the people that kind of run the sterile fly border, which is still very effective. The problem we're
Hmm.
having are the flies that are already over the border. Um, and he asked, so, what can we do? What can we do to like help in America? Or this veterinarian had asked his counterpart in Panama, like, what do we need to do to fix this? And his counterpart said, tell people what they're up against. He didn't have like oh, it's going to be fine. He was just tell people, spread the awareness, make everybody understand what this thing is and how bad it can get so that people act, like get people scared so that the government gets involved, make it known that this is happening because that is the only way you're going to get the resources to fight back. And that I think put a lot of fear in people who, maybe who had thought this was just like a blip on the radar, thought, some flies jumped the border, but it won't get here. And I think one of the things that made it so acute for me as a veterinarian got up and showed a picture and he showed Mexico and he's like, well, in order to stop the screwworm, you have to block them coast to coast. But look at the shape of Mexico. It's shaped like a funnel. Like every mile north the screwworm gains, that's more money, more flies that are going to be needed to firefight it south. And the problem gets bigger every day. And they've found flies as far north as Oaxaca. Uh, it's more than 1,000 cases have been reported since the start of the year. It's starting to really amplify the amount of new cases. Um, and I'm trying to remember what your original question was, but
Well,
it
if there
was,
was any
yeah.
chance of
Oh,
containment, like is there any chance that this does get contained, or are U.S. cattle farmers like it's gonna happen? It's just about like mitigating
you,
the damage now.
I I talked to farmers who wanted to believe that it would be contained, but no expert on this that I talked to seemed to believe that there was any way it could be contained. Because you can shut the border to cattle, but you can't shut the border to birds, you know? And screwworms can travel in birds. You can shut the border to bison, but you can't shut the border to deer. Once it gets into livestock, which it is inevitable that it will, it's very hard to contain how it moves. And there were some veterinarians who said, it could already be here. We just haven't seen it because it's in deer or it's
Mm.
in raccoons and it's just not obvious yet. And as much as people want to say it can be contained, another vet said to me, he's like, we're a long way off from winter. It's happening right now and we're only at the beginning of summer. And so we've got a long summer ahead of, peak screwworm season in Central America. So I think they'll be able to control the numbers to some degree using sterile flies, but the Panama factory can only produce like 100 million flies at max capacity. And when the US was fighting the screwworm further south in the 90s, they were using 500 million a week. So we're,
Jeez.
1/5 of the number of flies that we ultimately will need if it gets further north. So it's not, I don't want to be a total pessimist in that. There are treatments you can use, dewormers and ivermectin to treat an infection, but in terms of containment of where the screwworm will go, that is where I don't feel a ton of optimism.
Well, and that's also a labor and migration issue because to treat, you need people to actually go out and find the cows or treat them with the things. And all of these different farmers and ranchers across the United States are dealing with labor shortages or higher costs for labor, and that's
Yeah.
on top of all the other inputs and things that they're dealing with. So like it's just yet another thing they've got to worry about.
Yeah, and a number of ranchers I spoke to said, if it comes back, it'll be deadlier than it was before because we simply don't have the labor. So that's something that I thought was a great little historical fact, was one of the reasons that all of the world's greatest cowboys in rodeos came out of Texas. All the great champion ropers and cutting horses were all coming out of Texas, was because those ranchers were getting practice all day, every day, separating cattle from herds, roping them, treating them for screwworms, tying them up. So all those things that you see in a rodeo are actually based on very practical skills that cowboys use in their day to day. And there was a ton of farm labor at that time because the screwworm population was so bad. And since they got rid of the screwworm, you just didn't need that many cowboys. And there are very few cowboys in the US right now who have that, and very few ranchers who could afford to employ that number of cowboys and cowgirls if that was something that they needed. Most ranches are run on a very slim staffing, with very slim staffing numbers because you just don't need that many people anymore. It's much more mechanical, but that's not, you can't treat screwworms that way.
We'll see if my editor will listen to me and do this, but we should really have "Where Have All the Cowboys Gone" like start playing in the background as you're saying that. It's playing in my head, at least for the listeners. So
it's an all-time great song, and I had no idea that the screwworm was responsible for the lyrics.
Yeah, I mean, thank you also for confirming my, I've sort of built my life on the notion that ultimately you can explain everything with geopolitics. So even the fall of the American cowboy and the rise of the American cowboy again will be explained by geography and this intersection.
Truly, and science. So let's not forget about nippling again.
Don't worry, we'll put a picture of him beside my face, and maybe we'll start trying to spread the gospel. While you were talking, I was just looking at a map, and we'll put a map in the show notes so people can get this. I mean, so there have been cases reported, to your point.
Yes.
So how much further north are they? We don't know. But if you're talking about cases in Oaxaca and Veracruz, and if you're thinking about, that's still fairly low down in the funnel. Mm-hmm. But man, when you compare that to the width of the Darien Gap funnel, I mean, just looking at it roughly, I mean, you're talking 6 times, 8 times the width probably of the Darien Gap. And so to your point, if it's 100 million flies that can produce max in Panama for holding the line, and they have to hold the line, the idea that they're going to turn around and also send them northwards in order to hold the line at like a much different type of geography. It's really hard to have very much optimism if you're looking at the map.
Yvette described it to me as fighting a wildfire. You want to always fight it from the front line. You don't want to be throwing buckets of water in the middle of the fire because there's nothing you can do. So you really have to get like on top of it to push it back down. And that is what's going to be so challenging for everyone because just the restricted numbers of flies that we have.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anything I didn't ask you that I should have asked you, or anything you didn't get to include in the piece that you'd like to talk about here?
Oh my God. I mean, so much. I have so many more fun facts, and I'm trying to remember what they all were. But I mean, one of the things that's important to notice, the screwworms did come back to the US in 2015 in like a very isolated incident. They infected this deer in the Florida Keys. And the suspicion is they traveled in a passenger car. So somebody on a road trip kind of brought a screwworm by accident in their car, got into a local deer, and it spread through the deer population. And it took a while for them to identify because just nobody knew that that's what they were supposed to be looking for. But in a way that the Florida Keys are like the best case scenario for the USDA for having a reinfection because it's a tiny little peninsula. And you could like hit it with a very small amount of flies and just like suppress a population right away. So they were able to manage it very effectively, which gives hope, right? That this is something that could be managed still. We have the tools, but also makes you, a little bit frustrated that it didn't stick in the minds of the US that, they could come back. I think there are a lot of ranchers in Texas, especially right now, who are very, very anxious about this. Among all the other things that they have to deal with.
Is it just Texas, or like have neighboring states also started to wake up?
I haven't. Most of the conversation is happening through Texas. Texas has a very powerful cattle lobby who have been very vocal and trying to generate support. I think they had an unusual situation where there were some people in the lobby who had grown up on memories of the screwworm and kind of realized right away that this was something they needed to be paying attention to. So Texas has really been a leader in terms of galvanizing support and information about the screwworm. They've been sending pamphlets to veterinarians around the state to make sure that they know to look for it. Texas is also the place that you'll see it first because they do share the biggest border with Central and South America. Well, they do share the biggest border with Mexico and are the closest state to Central and South America.
Yeah, and the furthest south by a good bit. So
yes. Indeed. And they have a tremendous amount of wildlife, from deer to nilgai to wild sheep and feral hogs. And like feral hogs cover a really tremendous amount of ground. And so if a feral hog gets a screwworm, it has the capacity to spread it over miles and miles. So that's one of the reasons that Texas has a huge hunting economy. So they're nervous about that. But cows are so central to the identity of Texas that this has become something they've, you know, been paying attention to more than you've been hearing from other states.
Well, maybe somebody just needs to get the ear of the president and say, if you want Trump steaks to continue into the future as legacy for your children, like you might want to get on this, Mr. President. We got some things we got to do.
Doesn't he have a Big Mac every day? Isn't that? I mean, it's coming for his Big Mac. Prices will be impacted. Getting rid of the screwworm saved the American consumer like billions of dollars just in the cost of beef.
Well, maybe he'll have to take his own advice and he'll have to content himself to only one Big Mac a week rather than 3 or 4 different Big Macs a week.
And he might live longer. But it is an interesting time for this to happen, right? The U.S. has been increasingly isolationist, not wanting to engage in international cooperation to solve problems. And the eradication of the screwworm the first time was very much a team effort. It required a lot of politicking, a lot of cooperating with South American governments, Central American governments, a partnership with Mexico that was signed into a bill, essentially. So it's hard to imagine the same thing happening today. It's hard to imagine it going as smoothly as it did before. But, the U.S. at that time was very, very much saw itself as a leader. And I don't know that the U.S. wants to be a leader on things like screwworms at the moment.
Well, and to your point, these crises have a way of animating things. So you would hope that, and the hope would be that there's enough institutional memory and enough human capital to prevent something from becoming a crisis. But unfortunately, what you're describing to me sounds like there's going to be a crisis. And at some point, it's going to get bad enough that people are going to start making enough noise. And there will probably be an overwhelming and disproportionate response. And they'll throw, figures out the window and be like, okay, we just have to get it contained. But, it's sad because like the technology's there. It's really not that costly in the grand scheme of things. If we could have just gotten out of our own way and like worked on something that should be relatively simple, could have prevented the crisis from happening. But
America doesn't, it's not politically expedient to light fires over almost crises, right? You have to wait until something reaches a fever pitch to really like wave your hands around and say this is important. It's not easy to get people to spend millions of dollars on something that's not a problem yet, but could be a problem one day. And I think, I don't know. So I was talking to some anthropologists a little bit about why the U.S. doesn't like to remember bad things. Because there are some countries that, hold on to their traumas in the very constant way. There are places where, the hard things that they've gone through live right on the surface and are a part of daily life. And the U.S. is a very optimistic country, right? Like, when something's in the rear view, we don't place a value on holding on to negativity. We're very much like, okay, that's done. What's next? And in a way, we're very vulnerable to things like this happening again because we don't like to hold on to unpleasantness, and we don't like to. Which is a shame. There was this old man who I spoke to for the story who was a rancher, who also was a country medical doctor, like a very Purple Heart in Vietnam, a decorated doctor, very popular in his community. And he had had measles as a child. And he was so upset to hear about the screwworms gaining ground because he's just like, we've had solutions to all of these problems. We had vaccines. And now I have measles in Texas again. And we have sterile flies, and yet like these twin threats from his childhood are knocking on the door again. And he just was like, why does America not remember its achievements? Why can't we be proud of that and hold on to it? And I was like, Dr. Ferrier, I don't know. But it was just interesting to see, the shift in the way certain generations think about things versus, the modern generation where, if something's never been a part of your reality, it's really hard to make it a priority.
Yeah, I mean, if there's any silver lining there, it's sort of what you alluded to, which is we have fixes to these problems, and we're
Yeah.
really good at fixing problems. Like there's no problem here that we are discussing that is insurmountable. It's not a mystery. Like it's just about political will and some dollars and sterilizing some flies. Like there's got to be
Totally.
some nerd out there who's ready to make a big billion-dollar company out of this.
Maybe. I mean, we've certainly got enough billionaires to throw at this problem, but yeah, no, you're right. And America has never had a problem it couldn't solve, right? And so we love to think of ourselves as it's going to be okay in the end because we've always been okay in the end. And hopefully hopefully this can be another example.
All right. Madison, this was terrific. Tell the listeners where they can find more of your work.
I am working for the Bloomberg Weekend. So find me each weekend on Bloomberg.com. Coming up, male prostate health.
Great.
No, JK,
We'll have you back on to discuss the geopolitics of male prostate health, weaponizing the patriarchy in another way or a different way.
Honestly,
I don't know.
AI. It's all about AI these days. Oh, I didn't say how ranchers used to walk on the fields in the morning and find thousands of boxes from the screwworms that had been dumped over their ranches in the night by the by the airplanes. And also here's what it looks like.
Oh wow. Oh yeah.
It's a little mustache, like a little emoji.
Yeah, a little walrus almost.
Yeah, they're very cute, which is one of the reasons they have been taught in vet school because they're a fascinating case study for vet teachers to say look, science, and they look like emojis. But we'll see how sticky those lessons were.